dawn on August 7th, 1940-4, an unprecedented storm of steel was brewing on Hill 314 outside the town of Mortain in northern France. Fog blanketed the entire valley as 20-1-year-old Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss crouched in his foxhole, the batteries of his radio already beginning to weaken. The sound that froze his blood reached his ears, the treads of German tanks grinding along the road through the valley below, advancing toward his position. The hill, 314 meters above sea level, was the highest ground for 15 miles in any direction. It overlooked the river valley to the east, the small French town of Mortain into the north, and the single straight road running south to the coasted of ranches. That road was the lifeline Hitler had personally ordered for panzer divisions to seize. The German plan was to drive west along it, cut the route of the American breakout, trap General George Patton's Third Army, and turn the entire Normandy campaign on its head. Ed Weiss and his 700 comrades worst ending right in the way. For 5 full days and nights, they would forge a legend of staggering courage on this lonely hilltop. Beside Weiss was another forward observer, First Lieutenant Charles Bartz, and a 19-year-old corporal named Frank Ennius. These 3 young men had no heavy weapons, no reinforcements, and not even enough ammunition. But they possessed one thing, a precisely calibrated map and a list of calculated grid coordinates. Each coordinate corresponded to a number, and when Weiss spoke a number into his radio, the Fire Direction Center 5 miles back already knew exactly where to send the shells. He did not need to guide the guns onto the target or spot rounds and walk them in. He only had to say a number. Behind this seemingly simple action lay a system that had taken 15 years to build. A system that made the entire German army on the Western Front tremble with fear, one they could not escape no matter how cautiously they moved. At 1 in the morning, the Germans launched their attack. The lead tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division pushed into the streets of Mortain within the hour. They overran the cannon post of the 2nd Battalion and captured its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leeds Hardaway. The 3 rifle companies on Hill 314 were completely surrounded, their only link to the outside world, the radios in the hands of Weiss and Bartz. By every rule of any war ever fought, those surrounded Americans should have been captured or destroyed by noon that same day. But they were not. From August 7th to August 12th, for 5 full days and nights, 700 Americans on Hill 314 held off the repeated assaults of 3 panzer divisions. When the 30-5th Infantry Division finally broke through the encirclement and reached the hilltop, only 350-7 of the 700 were still able to walk down under their own power. And the southern arm of Hitler's offensive had collapsed completely. What made this possible was not the bravery of the rifle companies, though they were indeed brave beyond measure, but to lieutenants and one corporal who, armed with a single radio and an unprecedented fire control system, poured the annihilating weight of an entire corps worth of artillery onto every German assembly area, every line of march, every exposed position for 5 straight days. It was a breathtaking battle, and its roots traced back 15 years. To understand how this system came to be, we have to go back 15 years. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1920-9 was a tired post. The Field Artillery School had been there since 1911, and the budget cuts of the 1920s had left it drowsy and stagnant. Horses still pulled the guns, and the doctrine in the manuals was still essentially the doctrine of the Western Front in 1918. Each battery commander spotted his own rounds from a wooden tower near his own guns and adjusted fire by eye. There was no system to coordinate the fire of one battalion with another. If a forward officer wanted 3 batteries to fire on the same target at the same time, he had to telephone or ride to each one in turn, give them the data, and hope it still applied by the time everyone was ready. Most of the time, it did not. Into this sleepy school came a major named Carlos Brewer, who had been teaching at Fort Sill since 1920. Satan had been appointed director of the gunnery department. Brewer was not a flashy officer. He was the kind of man who liked mathematics. Through the 1920s, he had been watching how slow and clumsy his branch was at the most basic task any artillery is supposed to perform, putting a lot of shells on a small piece of ground at the same instant. He thought he could do better. He had no money, no special equipment, and no political backing. What he had was a few junior officers who were as obsessed with the problem as he was, and a body of recent graduates who could be persuaded to try things on the practice ranges that no field manual currently allowed. Brewer attacked the part of the system he believed was the bottleneck, the calculation. Every gun, in order to hit a target, needs a precise angle of fire and a precise elevation. Those numbers depend on where the gun is, where the target is, the weather, the temperature of the propellant, the wear on the barrel, and a dozen other variables. In 1920-9, every battery was doing those calculations on its own, with its own officers, using its own slide rules. Brewer asked a question that sounded almost rude inside his branch. Why does every battery need to compute these numbers separately? What if all the computation happened in one place? What if a single tent with one map and a small team of mathematicians took the call from the forward observer, did the math once, and sent the answers out to every gun within range simultaneously? It took Brewer and his department about 3 years to make the idea work on the range. By the spring of 1930-1, his department was successfully demonstrating massed battalion fire using a new firing chart method. By 1930-4, under his successor Major Orlando Ward, the system had been refined to the point that a single tent was the brain of an artillery battalion, and the gun batteries had become its hands. The Americans had begun to call this tent the Fire Direction Center. Ward's key contribution was his insistence that the system be designed so that any battery within range, regardless of which battalion it formerly belonged to, could be commanded to fire on any target the Fire Direction Center named. This principle meant that American artillery was no longer a collection of independent weapons organized by battery, but a single massive sword that could be wielded at will. This was something no other army in the world was doing. The British, the French, the Soviets, the Japanese, the Germans were all either devolving fire control downward to the battery commander or attempting centralization without ever achieving cross-minus battalion coordination. Only the Americans, in that unremarkable tent at Fort Sill, quietly completed this epic revolution. By the early years of the war, the Americans had a name for the killing technique this system enabled. They called it time on target. The principle was simple to state and difficult to execute. An ordinary artillery barrage rises in pitch. The first shells come in, the men on the ground hear them, and they dive for the bottom of their foxholes. Most of the casualties from the barrage are inflicted in the first round or two before everyone is down. After that, the barrage can go on for an hour without doing much. A time-on-target mission did not work that way. It was calculated so that all the shells from all the participating batteries would arrive on the target within a window of about 3 seconds. There was no first round. There was no warning whistle. There was no chance to dive. The men on the ground received the entire weight of 3 or 4 or 12 battalions of guns in the same instant. Casualties were therefore not concentrated in the first round because there was no first round. They were spread across every man in the target area. Every man who was upright, every man who was sleeping, every man who was relieving himself behind a tree. It was a spectacular and devastating form of destruction. This was the power Lieutenant Robert twice held at his disposal on the morning of August 7th, 1940-4, when the German tanks began to move below Hill 314. After the Germans launched their attack, Weiss and Bartz had already spent the previous afternoon plotting emergency barrage, numbers along every approach road and every assembly area their position commanded. When the German infantry came up the slopes in the darkness, Weiss did not even need to describe the target. He only had to call a number into the radio. The Fire Direction Center already had the data, and the shells were already in the air before the German soldiers even knew they had been spotted. The German commanders assumed that darkness would degrade the accuracy of American artillery. They were wrong. By the morning of August 8th, Weiss and Bartz had gained a second resource. The forward observers on Hill 314 had been given priority access to the heavy artillery of 7th Corps. Their fire missions were no longer limited to the 12 guns of the 230th Battalion. They could now call upon multiple battalions of 105-mm and 150-5-mm howitzers, and even the heavier Corps-level pieces. Over the next 4 days, those calls were almost continuous. The observers on the summit could see for 15 miles. Every German movement they could see, they called in. Every assembly area, every column on the road, every artillery battery that revealed itself by firing, every truck park, all of it was plotted, called in, and covered with fire. No matter how cautiously the Germans tried to conceal themselves, they could not escape the eyes of these observers. Conditions on the hill were terrible. After the second day, the Americans had no food. They had almost no water. Their radio batteries weakened steadily, and the men of the observer parties scavenged batteries from the dead and the captured. The Germans tried more than once to wipe the observers out specifically. White phosphorus rounds were dropped on the summit, and infantry assaults pressed against the perimeter. At one point, with German troops within rifle distance of his foxhole, Robert Weiss made a staggering decision. He called artillery fire directly onto his own position. The Fire Direction Center, miles away, took the call without arguing. The rounds came down where he asked. Weiss survived. The German infantry around him did not all survive. The hill held. By his own count later, Weiss alone had called in 190-3 fire missions during the 6 days. It was a breathtaking epic of combat. The 19-year-old corporal who had plotted those barrage numbers with Weiss and Bartz was Frank Ennius, from Athens, Texas. Born in January 1920-5 in Union, Pennsylvania, he had grown up in Athens, the small East Texas town his family considered home. He had been drafted, landed in Normandy on D-+/-3 with the 230th Field Artillery. He received his first Silver Star for an action on July 17, 1940-4, after which he was promoted from private first class to corporal. By the time of the Mortain battle, he was the chief of detail of 1st Lieutenant Charles Bartz's forward observer party. Before the war was over, he would receive the Silver Star 3 more times for actions during the fighting in Germany. 4 Silver Stars in less than a year. This quiet, unflashy young man finished the war as a staff sergeant, came home to Texas, went to law school at the University of Texas. He spent the rest of his life as an attorney in Austin, became one of the great benefactors of the University of Texas, and the indoor practice field on campus is named in his honor. He died on July 20-9th, 2018, at age 90-3. Ennius' story was, in a quiet way, representative of what made the American artillery system work. The Fire Direction Center could only mass fires as fast as the man at the radio could call them in. The man at the radio had to be capable of reading a map under shell fire, identifying a grid coordinate, calculating a correction in his head, and transmitting a coherent fire request without wasting a syllable. The Americans had a great many men who could do this. They were not, in the main, professional soldiers. They were teenagers and men in their early 20s from Iowa farms and Pennsylvania steel mills and Texas soil fields. They had been through an American public school system that had drilled basic geometry and decimal arithmetic into almost everyone who passed through the 8th grade. Most of them had grown up with country store credit ledgers, farm budgets, machine shop tolerances, and baseball box scores. Numbers were not strange to them. Numbers were a tool, and they had been using them since they were children. The Wehrmacht had observers too, and very good ones. But the Wehrmacht did not have a system that could translate an observer's request into the simultaneous fire of several battalions in a matter of minutes. According to the Army Historical Foundation's comparison, the German Army's typical response time from a call for fire on a target of opportunity to rounds on the target was on the order of 10 to 12 minutes. The American response time, even early in the war, was often under 3 minutes. By 1940-4, for pre-registered targets like the ones Weiss had plotted from Hill 314, it was sometimes under 1 minute. This was not a difference of equipment, it was a difference of architecture. The seemingly indestructible German war machine had become fragile in the face of this system. In the autumn of 1940-4, the same system met the Germans in a different kind of country and under different conditions. The country was the Hurtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile patch of dense fir woods, deep ravines, and steep slopes south of Aachen. The American First Army had been ordered to push through it as part of the broader effort to reach the Rhine. The fighting that resulted from September 1940- for into early February 1940-5 would become the longest single battle the United States Army has ever fought and one of the costliest. Several American infantry divisions were ground down inside the forest. The Germans, defending prepared positions in dense woods that masked observation and limited the use of armor, fought from log bunkers and well-dug foxholes, with overhead cover meant to shelter their men from the kind of fire they had survived in Russia. What the Americans brought into the forest, and what the Germans had not faced in Russia, was the way the canopy itself could be turned into a weapon. American artillery firing standard high-explosive shells with point-detonating contact fuses when the rounds passed through the upper branches of the fir trees, oft undetonated in the canopy itself 20 to 100 feet above the forest floor. The result, for the men in the foxholes below, was an airburst by accident. Steel splinters from the shell, plus a cloud of sharpened wood splinters from the shattered branches, came straight down into positions that had been dug to defeat ground-level explosions and were not prepared for fire from above. Ernest Hemingway, embedded as a war correspondent, described the experience to his readers in terms borrowed from the First World War, calling it Passchendaele with tree bursts. Colonel Charles Lanham, the regimental commander of the 20-2nd Infantry, summarized the asymmetry as bluntly as any commander has ever summarized a tactical problem. He observed that his troops were combing tree-burst fragments out of their hair while the German lay snug in his hole. But the German lay snug in his hole only as long as the canopy held. As the bombardments continued, the upper branches of the fir trees were gradually torn off, and the protective effect of the trees as bursting platforms diminished. As that happened, the position of the German infantrymen did not improve because the fire missions kept arriving and the foxholes themselves were now exposed. Then, in December 1940-4, the system acquired one more piece of equipment that took the survival rate of German troops in the open another long step downward. The piece of equipment was called the variable time fuse. The principle was not complicated, but it completely changed the way artillery killed infantry. A standard contact-fused shell, exploding when it struck the ground, dissipated most of its blast and a great deal of its shrapnel into the dirt. A man in a foxhole was reasonably safe from a contact-fused round unless it landed almost exactly in the foxhole with him. A fused shell did not land. It exploded above the foxhole in the air, and the shrapnel from the burst traveled downward in a cone. And the man in the foxhole, no matter how deep he had dug it, was inside that cone. Trench cover, log roofs, the sort of overhead protection that German infantry had relied on against Soviet shelling on the Eastern Front, none of it worked against VT air bursts because the explosion was happening above the cover. General George Patton, after the Battle of the Bulge, wrote a letter to Major General Levin Campbell Jr., the chief of Army Ordnance, and said that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating. He described one fire mission against a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River near Echternach in late December. The mission, by his count, killed 702 men. He wrote that he believed when other armies eventually obtained the fuse, the methods of land warfare would be fundamentally changed. In another wartime letter, Patton put it more simply. He said the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for them. The most concentrated demonstration of the Veit Usen, the underlying American fire control system during the Ardennes campaign, was the defense of the small Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, holding the perimeter under Brigadier General Anthony Mikolev, had been encircled by elements of multiple German divisions. The town was a critical road hub on the German axis of advance, and the German plan depended on taking it quickly. They did not take it. One of the reasons they did not was that the 101st was supported inside the perimeter by a substantial force of artillery, including the 320-1st Glider Field Artillery Battalion, the 370-7th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, the 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalion, and the 460-3rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. The 460-3rd was an unusual case. Cooper had volunteered his battalion to Mikolev within 40-5 minutes of hearing that the 101st was being rushed to Belgium. The battalion had reached Ola, just outside Bastogne, in time to be inside the encirclement when the Germans closed it on December 20th. As the perimeter contracted under German pressure, the artillery battalions inside it found themselves with overlapping fields of fire across every approach. Whatever direction the Germans came from, multiple battalions could mass on them. By December 20-3rd, with the weather clearing enough for resupply by air, ammunition began to arrive in quantity. By December 20-6th, when the relief column from Patton's Third Army broke through the southern German line and reached the perimeter, the gun batteries inside Bastogne had spent days dropping mass fires on every German unit that attempted to close on the town. The German 20-6th Volksgrenadier Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division all left battalion-sized formations dead in the snow on the Bastogne approaches. The most useful evidence of what American artillery actually did to the German army is not a single dramatic statement. It is a body of after-action reports, prisoner-war interrogations, and post-war interviews that the Allied intelligence services accumulated through 1940-4 and 1940-5. The United States Army expanded this into the Foreign Military Studies program, where captured German officers were paid to write monographs about their experience. What those documents show, again and again, is that the American artillery problem was one the Wehrmacht had no doctrinal answer for. They did not have the equipment to match, did not have the supply of shells to imitate, and at the speed it was happening did not have time to learn. It is not that the Germans, at any level, failed to notice. They noticed. Their reports describe the American fire patterns with careful, almost respectful, professional precision. But noticing a problem and solving it are separated by the distance of an entire war. The Germans tried every countermeasure they could think of. They attacked at night. They attacked in bad weather. They dispersed their forces. They dug deeper. But the American fire direction centers had already registered every road and crossroads, and bad weather only affected accuracy at the margins without stopping the system. By the early spring of 1940-5, German reports noted that no method of countering American artillery had so far produced any consistent benefit. The United States Army Surgeon General's office found that fragmentation from artillery and mortar shells was the dominant cause of battle wounds. The typical German infantryman on the Western Front was most likely to be hit by the explosion of an American artillery shell that had not been aimed at him personally. The Germans had built one of the great armies of human history. They had not built it to fight under the kind of artillery the Americans brought to France in 1940-4. No one had ever built an army to fight under that. The American system had been an accident of peacetime poverty, an answer to a budget problem, a quiet experiment in centralization conducted by majors at a military school. Robert Weiss, the lieutenant on Hill 314, survived the war. He went home to Indiana and later moved to Oregon, where he founded a law firm and practiced business and tax law for decades. Almost half a century after the battle, he wrote a memoir of his August on the Hill called Fire Mission, published in 1990-8. Charles Bartz also survived the war. Frank Ennius lived until 2018. The men of the rifle companies who had held the perimeter around the observers, those of them who survived, scattered after the war into the small lives that veterans of large wars usually returned to. Most of them never wrote anything down. The hill itself is still there. It is a small park now, with a memorial chapel built in stone, with stained glass panels inside that name the men who held the position from August 7th to August 12th, 1940-4. There are still traces of the foxholes around the summit. The view, on a clear day, runs for 15 miles. That is the answer to the question we started with. Why did German infantry on the Western Front say American artillery was impossible to survive? They said it because the system that had been quietly built at Fort Sill in the late 1920s, refined through the late 30s, equipped with the variable time fuse in the winter of 1940-4, and put into the hands of teenagers and young men with radios on hilltops and in steeples and in attic windows from Normandy to the Rhine, did something no other army in the world had built itself to do. It allowed an ordinary American forward observer, sometimes a corporal, sometimes a lieutenant, sometimes a sergeant, almost never a senior officer, to call down the entire weight of an army's guns on a patch of ground, and to do it before the men on that ground had any time to consider what was about to happen to them. If you want to hear more about the forgotten ordinary people whose stories deserve to be remembered, hit that like button and subscribe so that this history worth remembering can continue to be seen.